One of the main reasons that Fox and I continue to push so hard for the advancement of participatory defense is because we know that it has been tried, we know that it has been tested, and we know that it has been proven to work. Participatory defense is transformative. It is changing the landscape of our criminal justice system. One of the ways that we measure success with participatory defense is that we measure it based upon the amount of time that we save an individual opposed to the amount of time that an individual serves behind bars. Nationally speaking, we have saved more than 10,000 years worth of time. Here locally at our local hub, we have saved more than 300 years since the inception of our organization, April of 2019.
300 years, participatory defense works.
So I asked the young people, what do you do with a criminal justice system that produces these results for young people? Hands shot up across the classroom, and I called on a young person who was 12, and he said, you know what you do? You know what you do? You end that system and you create a new one. And that's what the 150 Years is Enough campaign is about. We seek to fundamentally transform the way that youth justice happens in New Jersey, beginning by treating kids ensnared in it with the kind of compassion that we're able to marshal for white kids ensnared in the opioid crisis. We also seek to totally transform the way that we make investments. We make deep investments in youth incarceration, not surprisingly then producing these racial disparities in which a black child is 30 times more likely to be in prison than a white child. We want to flip that.
Our nation's criminal justice system is inherently unjust. The inhumanity of our criminal justice system has a wide and pervasive impact throughout our communities. Our nation's criminal justice system is inherently unjust. The inhumanity of our criminal justice system has a wide and pervasive impact throughout our communities.
We really believe that we're at a critical point in time, especially in our country and in our state, that we have to transform the way justice is.
We need justice that's just. One of our partners taught us, if you want something you've never had, you have to be willing to do something you've never done.
We're dealing with a justice crisis, and how we're able to really work and impact that crisis
is to have that sort of relationship with community partners, those who are most impacted by the system itself.
It means the people that actually eat there, sleep there, they take their children out to play in those same streets, in those same neighborhoods. Those are the people that build the community, that create the environment that's there.
They have the greatest contribution to make to our work.
Through the work of leaders in our communities, we will transform the criminal justice system and uplift millions of people whose lives have been unjustly impacted by decades of inaction.
And we're proactively thinking about how can communities play a role in truly supporting young people and making sure that each and every young person in this country has the opportunity to thrive and be successful.
We aim to destigmatize and decriminalize mental illness by connecting people to the resources that they need for unmet mental health needs, therefore creating solutions that are alternatives to incarceration.
One way that we are striving to advance a transformative vision of justice is through participatory defense. Participatory defense is the teaching of legal awareness as the best form of defense.
We are fighting for large-scale changes in law that are evidence-driven, community-rooted, and racially just.
That's justice. That's just. Good afternoon and welcome to Justice That's Just. I'm Candace Jones, President and CEO of the Public Welfare Foundation. And on behalf of our entire team and our board, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here. We had a lot of conversations about whether or not we wanted to add to the noise of this moment in history. What I know for sure is that each one of us in our respective lives, in the last 18 months, we have been through some things. But we decided that we wanted to bring our partners together to remind us all that we have community. That's what this conversation is designed to do. Justice That's Just is about reminding all of us that the thing that we're working towards is not a moonshot. It is the full realization of something already promised by this nation. All the speakers that you hear are designed just to support that mission. We're not asking you this afternoon to be stronger, to push harder, to go further. We know you're already doing that. We actually hope this afternoon's conversation sparks joy, reminds you that you are not alone in this work, that we can all still collectively learn and enjoy ourselves, and that if you need to, take a rest. We'll all be here when you get back. Our first speaker this afternoon is Kelly Carter Jackson, an academic who every time I hear her speak or read her writing, it invites me to think deeper about an issue. She writes about Black activist movements throughout history, forcing us to deal with the relationship between power and violence and to examine those historical movements as we think about the movements that we've yet to seed. The second panel is designed just to remind you that in this work, you are not alone. Whether you're Richard Morales in Colorado, working to take money out of the deep end prison system and reinvest it in a community continuum of care, growing a fund from $500,000 to more than $7 million, and ensuring that more than 60% of the people employed in the program are formerly incarcerated. Perhaps you're Mark Mertens, our partner in Wisconsin, who's a juvenile justice system leader, who's working right now on a plan to zero out the number of youth in custody, ensuring that Milwaukee's children are served in Milwaukee neighborhoods. Or maybe you're Patrice Sultan, who just launched the DC Justice Lab, working on a model criminal code that demystifies those laws for the citizens that are governed by them. She's ensuring that Black and Brown people have agency and access to that process. Or maybe you're Ernest Johnson at Mbutu Village, who trains parents on how to navigate the juvenile justice system, reminding them that they have power and they are not alone. That conversation will be moderated by Athena Robinson Mark, our partner from Communities for Just Schools, and it is designed to remind you that you have power and you are not alone in this work. The final conversation will be between myself and Amanda Alexander at the Detroit Justice Center and Gina Clayton Johnson at SE Justice Group in California. Both of them have started organizations where they've baked Black feminist principles into the mission, ensuring that those organizations are thinking about how to take care of their staff, take care of themselves, and by extension, take care of the people that they're working on behalf of. I'm thrilled to have you here. Grab your cup, whether or not you got a justice mug or not, sit back and enjoy this conversation that we are about to have. I can assure you 3 things will happen this afternoon. 1, somebody's gonna say something that inspires you. 2, there might be a tech glitch. It is that moment in history, y'all. In the spirit of this conversation, sit back, have some grace about it, and laugh. Our amazing group at Meeting Tomorrow will get us back online in no time. And 3, there's gonna be mutiny at the Public Welfare Foundation, y'all, because they've been gonna be coming for me about some Black feminist principles in our mission, but I'm ready for it, and that is all right. A couple of housekeeping things this afternoon. Listen, if we want to hear from you, we're glad that you're here. If you want to comment, tell us how you're feeling, join the conversation by telling us what's in your mind, join the chat. If you have a question, something that you want to put to myself or one of the panelists, each one of the conversations will end with a Q&A session. Please drop that, a thing that ends with a question mark and is designed to elicit a response into the Q&A. Please also join us in the conversation on social media. Be sure to hashtag Justice That's Just, tag the Public Welfare Foundation, or any one of our incredible speakers this afternoon. Like I said, we're thrilled to have you here. Let's have some peace and enjoy ourselves. And with that, I am thrilled, over the moon thrilled to introduce our first speaker to you. Every time I hear this woman, I think about things that I think I already know in a whole new way. Ms. Kelly Carter Jackson.
Hi everyone.
That is not your Zoom. That is me just pausing dramatically. Hey, Kelly, because I want to make sure I put appropriate respect on your name. Okay, ma'am. Give me just a second. I want to read a little bit, and I'm going to read this, you guys, because I want to make sure I get this right. Kelly is Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Her book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, was the first historical analysis focused on the use of violence among antebellum Black activists. Force and Freedom won the James Broussard Best First Book Prize and was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Her essays have been featured in, wait for it, Times, Post, Atlantic, Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, NPR Times, The Conversation, and Boston's local NPR affiliate. All I need is a DMXB. And then she has also been a contributing speaker on MSNBC, Sky News UK, Times, Guardian, PBS, Vox, HuffPost, C-SPAN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and the Slate, to name a few. She is the mother of 3 beautiful Black children, all named for Black abolitionists, which I love. Married to a man she's known since she was 7. She's bad, y'all, and just getting started. Kelly, I'm so glad to have you here. How are you?
Great. I'm great. That is probably the best introduction I have ever had.
I have to go because you spark joy for me, so I'm so glad to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. I cannot say how grateful I am to just share some of my thoughts, words, ideas with you. I'm so, so happy. I know we're talking about joy today, and I just want to say before I get started, before I get into all of this, how much it just brings me joy to be able to talk about these issues with people that care, with people that are invested, with people that are doing the work. So even though I can't see you, I'm feeding off your energy. I hope you're feeding off mine, and we're gonna have a good time today. It's gonna be really empowering.
All right, I love it. I'll be back to join you in the Q&A as Kelly is giving her presentation. Join us again in the Q&A section with questions and let us know how you're feeling in the chat. Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you. I'm actually setting my timer because I do not want to be a Baptist minister and go on for 2-3 hours.
I'm sure I'm over my 5 minutes.
always checking my time. And I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's make sure this pops up. There we go. I hope everyone can see all of this. So let's just dive in. Looking back to move forward, a history of violence and joy in America. So this talk for me started last year, as I'm sure many of you know. The world, or at least throughout America and actually all around the world, kind of got turned upside down on what people have been calling this racial reckoning. And I wrote an op-ed in The Atlantic about this moment and about how we should think about not just George Floyd, but violence and protest in general. And so I started the article with thinking all the way back, because I'm a historian and I can't tell any story without invoking history. I started thinking about the genesis of this country, and I started thinking about how much we condemn violence, but also how much we love violence, how much we romanticize violence, how when we think of the American Revolution, we have these ideas of give me liberty or give me death. And we talk about the Boston Tea Party and we talk about the Boston Massacre and how much we are a nation founded on protest, political protest. And because I live outside of Boston, all of this just resonates so much with me because K through 12 students are given this history of the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party and the American Revolution and Concord and Lexington. And we have really this, I think, seductive relationship with violence that we've not always been honest about. So I wanted to use that op-ed and use a lot of my research and writings to sort of tease out these contradictions and talk about what they really mean. We have had a historical double standard, not just in the way that we talk about history, but in the way that we're presented history. When we talk about what is known as the age of revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution is like front and center. But often the Haitian Revolution, which involved, free Black people, enslaved Black people rising up for their liberation, that moment almost is a footnote in our understanding. It's not something that we readily recall. But in the age of revolutions, it was really the only revolution that pushed for full emancipation of all enslaved people, that actually pushed for liberty and democracy and justice. But oftentimes we don't talk about the Haitian Revolution, or we only talk about it in terms of its heinous acts, in terms of the gratuitous violence. We talk about, Haitian leaders as though they're boogeymans that have haunted, Europe and killed Europeans. And I found all of this to be pretty incredible, even when we talk about the history of slave rebellions. All throughout history, especially in America, slave rebellions are told from a place of fear and terror and trauma. It's never about Black liberation. It's never taken from the standpoint of Black humanity. Even in these pictures right here, these old sketchings, you'll notice that all of the white people, their faces and their features are drawn in, but all of the Black people in this they're like just blobs, they're shadows, they're these really dark, less than human, terroristic rebels. That is how it is portrayed. And so that history, that historical context has really shaped how we have understood protest, depending upon who's doing the protesting. So I always use this clip because I think these two images, because I think they pair so well. And this comes from a quote, I didn't create it. This is Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who talks about in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness. He says there's a prevailing myth that white people commit crimes, but Black people are criminals. White people commit crimes, but Black people are criminals. Meaning that when white people do something, well, that's not really who they are, right? That's not their identity. But before Black people can even commit a crime, no, that's who they are. They are criminals. So when we see this instance of Michigan State, and this is Michigan State, when it wins a game, when it loses a game, when it ties a game, right? Like this is Austin, like, the Boston Red Sox. There are a lot of cities that are notorious for turning over their cities with a victory or a loss. But then when we look at Baltimore and we look at the death of Freddie Gray, who died in police custody, these images are very similar. But the one on the right, the one with the college students, is sort of a boys will be boys kind of. White people are committing crimes. That's not who they are. They're college students. They're happy. They're excited. This just happens. But when we think about Baltimore, these are thugs. These are looters. These are punks. There's a completely different narrative that takes place when we look at violence. I think that, maybe in the past 2 or 3 years, we've started to have these conversations about what it means to really tease out political violence and acts of riots and rebellion and looting and unrest and look at the heart of it. What is causing it? What is motivating it? And what are people responding to? So I use this image a lot because I think that, there's a line in the op-ed I write about when I'm telling my mother last year when people were protesting over George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. I said to my mom, I just had a baby, and I said, I want to be out in the streets. I want to be protesting. I want to be out there. But I didn't feel safe from a health perspective, having just given birth, but also from a pandemic perspective as well. And my mom said to me something that really disheartened me. She said, this happened in 1968. The same thing happened when I was your age. Don't worry, just keep on living. You'll get your chance. And I was like, I don't want another chance. I don't want another opportunity to be out in the streets. I don't want to feel like I'm missing, a carnival. I want to bring about change. And it's so interesting that when we don't take into effect history, when we don't realize mistakes that have been made or how history can serve as a roadmap, as an echo, as a blueprint for how we might go forward, I think we miss out on a lot. I think not only do we miss out on a lot, but we repeat the same things over and over and over again. And I don't want my children to grow up and be in a similar position as me, where I'm saying to them, don't worry, you'll get another chance. So a lot of my ideas have come from this place of trying to use history as a tool, as a way of understanding how we might stop the injustice that we all live in, and how we might use history as not just a way to understand how we might go forward, but a way to understand how we cannot commit the same atrocities. So I want us to think about some questions, and I'm just going to pull them all up right here. But I want us to really think about, what is violence? What is violence? How have we made this word sort of a catch-all? I think there's a tremendous difference between a cop car being turned upside down, a cop car even set on fire, and the bullet that killed Breonna Taylor and the knee to the neck to George Floyd. We should be able to distinguish the destruction of property and the death of people as two different things. And that to me has caused me to say we have to be specific about what violence is. And we should not hold people and property on the same playing field. The second question is, how should the oppressed respond to their oppressors? What is the appropriate response? I study the abolitionists. So when I'm looking at enslaved people or fugitives, and I think to myself, well, they didn't have the vote. Not really. They didn't have citizenship. How do you respond to your oppression, to your oppressors, when you don't have access to the traditional channels that would push you towards change in a nonviolent way? I think about the role of the state. I think about, how should the nation respond to political dissent? What is the responsibility of the government to respond to its people? What is the appropriate response to its people when these uprisings and uprisings and rebellions take place? And then I think about violence, if it is ever justified, if we can think of moments when, violence was something useful, something effective. When is that? For me, it's slavery. The abolitionists rationalized that since slavery was created by violence, since it was sustained by violence, it only made sense that it would be overthrown by violence. But I want to talk about the ways in which we have justified violence throughout history. And then lastly, this kind of ties into the third question, but how do the powerless procure power? How can the powerless procure power? Is that possible? And if so, what does that look like? So these are the questions that I just want us to frame, and we can come back in the Q&A, but I think they're worth thinking about. So as mentioned before, my book is Force and Freedom, shameless plug, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. But one of the things I'm always pointing out is that, they were called the abolitionists, not the reformers, not the reformers. They were not trying to reform slavery or make good masters. They were trying to abolish, eradicate, dismantle the entire institution of slavery. And what I love about the abolitionists is that they are so representative of all of America. They were men, they were women, they were Black, they were white, they were born free or fugitives or formerly enslaved. And all of them, poor or wealthy, played a unique and special role and represent actually a very, very small percentage of the population in terms of moving the system of slavery into oblivion. And so for me, the abolitionists and their strategies and their toolbooks have been so helpful in thinking about how we might take some of their own ideas and implement them in our current moment. I think about what Joshua Easton said, who's a famous Black abolitionist. He says this in 1837. He says, abolitionists may attack slaveholding, but there's a danger still that the spirit of slavery will survive in the form of prejudice after our system is overturned. Our warfare ought not to be against slavery alone, but against the spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. The spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. Basically saying like, you can abolish slavery, but if you don't deal with anti-Blackness, if you don't deal with the spirit of slavery, these systems, these ideas, these discriminatory practices will still be with us. And he's not wrong. In a lot of ways, I think of this quote as being so prophetic. It's so telling about how things have changed or not changed because we have failed to address the spirit of slavery. And what do I mean by the spirit of slavery? When I mean the spirit of slavery, I'm talking about housing and segregation and healthcare and education and mass incarceration, police brutality, wealth gap, voting rights and suppression, hiring practice, beauty politics, our friendships. Like, to me, nothing has really exploded the spirit of slavery more than the pandemic, because we have gotten to see real racial inequities, real economic inequities, all throughout America at every single level. The pandemic has laid bare this spirit of slavery, this mark of degradation, this anti-Blackness that we are all still grappling with to this day. But I also think, again, going back to the abolitionists, that Frederick Douglass says something to me that's so revealing, so powerful. He's talking about the causes of rebellion, and he's giving this about a year or so after the Civil War has ended, about a year after the 13th Amendment has passed. And Douglass says, there's a cause to be thankful, even for rebellion. It is an impressive teacher, though a stern and terrible one. And then he cautioned us to remember that the thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion. The thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion. And for me, it summarizes so much of the anger and the rage that we have been experiencing in this past year, past years, and that sometimes the media and others push this narrative of the rebellion and never the causes of the rebellion. And they teach us that the most thing we need to fear is turned over cop cars or things set on fire, but not the causes that motivated that violence, that rage, that anger. So we don't discuss, the roots of police brutality. We don't discuss mass incarceration. We don't discuss police brutality. We don't discuss, Black health disparities. We just look at the rebellion itself, the anger itself, and we make the anger the problem and not the cause of the anger. So I want to give us some staggering statistics, because I think these really color or paint a better picture for why the causes of rebellion compel people to have these responses. When I think about 2020 alone, 1 to 2 Black people are actually killed per week by the police. Every single week. When I think about these numbers in terms of history, when we think about the nadir, which is the early 20th century period between 1896 and about 1915, in which 2 Black people are lynched per week, when that is your reality, when at any moment something violent could happen to you, that statistic is a scary one. It's a terrifying one. And it's one that orients all of your movement in the world. In Massachusetts, the state that I live in, there are not a lot of Black people. We're about 7% of the population, but about 27% of the prison population. So how is it that 7% of the population, but 1 in 4 of us are locked up? These numbers aren't organic. They don't just happen. It's not, oh, so unfortunate. This is orchestrated, not organic, but orchestrated oppression against marginalized people, poor people, people of color. When I think about economic inequalities, and I think about the Boston Globe and how they had this article that debuted a few years ago in which they talked about the average net wealth of a white family in Boston was over $200,000. I can't even get my head around that. $200,000. But the average net worth for Black families is like 8 cents. And then the subtext was, no, that's not a typo, like 8 cents. Effectively, Black people have no wealth. They have no wealth, and certainly not compared to their white counterparts. And then the next statistic, which so many of us know all too well, is the disproportionate rates of Black and Indigenous and people of color that have been dying from COVID-19 and are still dying despite the vaccine in disproportionate rates. And these are just a few. I tried to pull from health and wealth and incarceration. These are just a few relics of the spirit of slavery. So I know we always talk about this in terms of white privilege. White privilege has become all the rage lately, but I think it's such a powerful component to understanding racism. Oftentimes we only talk about racism in terms of its disadvantages, in terms of the harm it causes. We don't talk about racism in terms of its profitability. We don't talk about racism in terms of how it benefits certain groups of people. And so when we talk about white privilege, I really want to make clear that this is not about, your life being easy, you're not having to work hard if you're white. It's about your skin color not being one of the things that makes it harder. It's about that mark of degradation not applying to your personhood. And this is what I think we have to constantly keep in mind. So Jen Chudy, she's a colleague of mine at Wellesley College, a really good friend and a brilliant political scientist. You may have heard her on NPR's Code Switch last week. If you haven't, check out the episode. It is so, so good. It's still sitting with me. It's so powerful. But she's done a lot of research about white attitudes towards politics and white attitudes toward other groups. And in her research, she found that only 1 in 5 white Americans consistently express high levels of sympathy about racial discrimination against Black Americans. Only 1 in 5. She said that many Americans have chosen places to live, places to send their children to school, places to vacation, jobs to pursue, in ways that allow them to completely avoid thinking about racial inequity or racial inequality. And then she talks about George Floyd and says the condemning of George Floyd was relatively costless. Then who's going out on a limb when they're distancing themselves from a murderer? And on this recent, episode of Code Switch, she talked about how they wanted to see sympathy that white people had for the Black Lives Matter movement and found that it was at an all-time high with George Floyd. 1 year later, they polled those same white people again and found out, what is their sympathy for Black Lives Matter now? It was lower than what it had been before George Floyd was killed. Lower. So it was like, oh, I feel bad. No longer feel bad anymore. And out of all the people that they surveyed, only about 10% of white Americans actually felt like sympathy or compelled to action in terms of how they believed racism was having an impact on their lives. And that to me is really sobering. The fact that many white Americans are not only passionate about racism, but largely indifferent about racism and how it impacts other people. And Martin Luther King Jr. talks about this. He says whites, it must be frankly said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It's an aspect of a sense of their superiority that white people in America believe they have so little to learn. The reality of substantial investment to assist Negroes in the 20th century, adjusting to Negro neighbors and genuine school integration is still a nightmare for all too many white Americans. Still a nightmare. Sociologists have done studies that found when a neighborhood becomes more than 7% Black, 7%, they put their homes on the market. When the neighborhood becomes more than 7% Black, people are uncomfortable. It's time to sell, time to move. How do we even make sense of that? How do we even make sense of that? So I wanna talk about violence and go back to violence because I think that, again, it's so instructive. When we think about the civil rights movement, we think about this with rose-colored glasses. We look back on the civil rights movement as a time when white people and Black people were holding hands and kings giving great speeches and Rosa Parks is refusing to give up her seat on the bus. We have all of these romantic ideas about that moment. And even this picture, just as a side note, I have to say that the picture of Rosa Parks is actually staged. The man sitting beside her is actually a journalist, and they posed her in this way to say, you know, sort of, we'll sit you right here in the front and then just, you know, look out in the window like you're looking at the distance, looking at a better future. But this picture is also so resonant because it marks the kind of activism that so many people wanted to see, which was hands clasped in your lap, not looking straight forward, off in the distance, this very passive, nonviolent form of activism. In which, in this picture, Rosa Parks is not even centered. As Westerners, we're taught to read everything from left to right. So we don't even really see her first in the image. That is also political. But that is the way that people wanted to see the civil rights movement. When really, the civil rights movement is about a response to violence. It's about violence at every single turn, violence in registering people to vote, violence against 14-year-old little Black boys, violence in lynching, violence with fire hoses leashed upon children, teenagers. It's about lunch counter abuse and harassment. The civil rights movement is nothing but violence, deadly violence, verbal violence. But somehow we think of the Black Panthers as being like more scary than the Klan. And I show this because there's so many examples of violent death. But then when Black people use guns or arms to symbolically, I think that's really important, symbolically assert their Second Amendment rights, their ability to be able to protect themselves from corrupt, police departments. That's all that we focus on. But as a historian, again, I'm always going deeper. And one of the things I found out, not just in my own research, but from other Black Panther scholars, is that the Black Panther Party kind of relinquished their position on guns early on when they found out that it wasn't the most effective tool to getting towards liberation. They found out that the most effective tools in the Black Panther Party was their breakfast program, was their sickle cell testing program, their public health programs, their ambulance programs, their free food clinics, their educational or literacy programs, the schools that they had created. This is a picture of Rosa Parks visiting a Black Panther school. And this just made me think that, wow, when we think about real revolutionary action, the major threat of the Black Panther Party was not guns. The major threat to white supremacy was Black people who were fed and healthy and literate. Fed, healthy, and literate. That sparked the real fear by the FBI and Hoover and COINTELPRO and all of that. The guns was the symbolic, superficial way of dismissing the Panthers. But the real work that was being done was what was most effective and impactful. And there are people who would give testimony to this all day long. They will praise the Panthers, not because they protected them with guns, but because they fed them and taught them how to read and made sure that their mother's health was taken care of. So when we think about the movement for Black lives, it's just as simple as what the Black Panthers were trying to do. It's about protecting Black humanity, preserving Black humanity, getting people to acknowledge that Black people are human, which seems like a really low bar. But it's a starting place. Like BLM is not the where we finish, it's where we start the conversation. But I think when we think about the history of these moments, of these movements, you know, Black people have always protested for their freedom, always. They've always spoken up against injustice. And what I found is that whether you take a knee, or you throw a Molotov cocktail, or you boycott, or you vote, there's no form of white supremacy. There's no form of protest that white supremacy is going to approve of. There's no form of protest that white supremacy is going to sanction and be like, you know what, I support this message. White supremacy does not want to be eradicated, right? White supremacists do not want to be eradicated. And so it doesn't matter what you do. Black people have been nonviolent and been murdered. Black people have used force and been murdered. Black people have used violent force and been murdered. There is no form of protest that is not going to come up against some sort of violent confrontation from white supremacy. So what does that mean? I think it means a couple things. I think we have to think about, how do we go forward? I say to my students all the time, if this was your past and this was your present, what would you do to make sure that racism was not your future? What is going to be the next image that your generation shows? Will it be better than the violence that we have constantly seen in my mother's generation and now in my generation? I'm thinking about my children. So there's some hard, there's some hard things that we have to be honest about. And that is primarily in this country, racial violence flows in one direction, almost always flows in one direction. We've seen this with the Dylan Roof and the Kyle Rittenhouse and the Heather Heyer. We've seen how people of color, Black people in particular, are almost always under attack and never the perpetrators of violence. We see this in mass shootings, be it Sandy Hook or Las Vegas, and we can go on and on and on when it comes to these mass shootings. And especially when it comes to the Capitol, right? You would never see, and that's one of the things we've talked about before, never see this Black people or BLM people doing this. And that is because the primary perpetrators of racial violence have not been Black people. And that is something that we have been unwilling to acknowledge, that the primary perpetrators of racial violence have not been Black people, that the civil rights movement is not about nonviolence. It's about a response to violence, racialized, terroristic, white supremacist violence, and that the primary victims of racial violence have almost always been Black people and their allies. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? I think I'm going to caution us to not come up with like 3-point plans. I'm totally like against that. I think oftentimes we're like, so what's the plan? So what are we going to do? Give me your 3 points. That's not how this works. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. I do think that it is okay to follow the thought of Miriam Makeba, who says, you're allowed to say not this and keep it moving. You're allowed to say, you know what, I don't know what the answer is, but not this. This ain't it. This isn't the solution. I don't know where we go from here, but I know what it isn't. And sometimes it's incredibly powerful to not necessarily know what a solution is, but to know what it isn't, to know what won't work, to know what has not been effective. I often think that in America, we have put too much emphasis on crime, criminality. And Miriam Makeba also talks about how not all crimes are harms and not all harms are crimes. What matters most is what is harmful. What matters most is what is harmful. So when we go back to that Michigan State slide and we think about, the fans that are tearing up the city and then the Baltimoreans that are angry and enraged, what is it that matters? The crime that's being committed or the harm that is traumatizing communities because of police brutality, because of mass incarceration? Those are the things that we ought to be most focused on. So I want to give you a couple things and start to wrap up. I know that people have been talking about books like crazy. A lot of people sold a lot of books last year, and myself included. You know, I'm an author. I want to sell books. That's great, but that is not a solution either. That at the end of the day, it's not going to be about what you read, but about what you did. It's not about what you read. I think reading is a first step. It's how you get information. It's how you get understanding. It's how you get, wisdom, but it is not the last thing you do. It is not, okay, read that book. It was great. I'm changed, right? Like that is not sufficient. So I want to call us to move beyond literacy. For those who haven't embarked on literacy, yes, read, get books, get knowledge. And if you can't read, listen. If you can't listen, watch. There's a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of documentaries, there's a lot of ways to get information. But then don't just sit with that. Let it mobilize you. Let it mobilize you. There's this great quote by Aimé Césaire in which he talks about us being spectators. And he says, beware of the crossing of your arms and the sterile attitude of the spectator, because life is not a spectacle, because a sea of sorrows is not a theater. A man who screams is not a dancing bear. A man who screams is not a dancing bear. This is not a performance. Black pain is not performative. And we have to be able to move beyond literacy and book reading and hand-holding to get at the heart of the pain and the trauma and the violence that has wreaked havoc on so many people's lives, to get at the spirit of slavery, as Joshua Easton would say. But I want to wrap up, and I want to end with this. I want to end with a couple things, actually, but we'll start with this because I always want to end on a high note. I want to give you hope. Imani Perry says something that has stuck with me every single day since I've read it. She says, racism is terrible. Blackness is not. Racism is terrible. Blackness is not. And this is a lengthy quote, but it is worth reading. She says, American racism is unquestionably rapacious. To identify the achievement and acceleration in Black life is not to mute or minimize racism, but to shame racism, to damn it to hell. The masters were wrong in the antebellum South when they described the body-shaking, delighted chuckle of an enslaved person as simple-mindedness. No, that laugh, like our music, like our language, like our movement, was a testimony that refused the terms of our degradation. In the footage of the protests over the past several weeks, we have seen Black people dancing, chanting, singing. Do not misunderstand. This is not an absence of grief or rage or distraction. It is insistence. It is insistence. So with that, I know we're like running out of time, but I had two more slides to show you, but I will save it for Q&A. But I just want to say that at the end of the day, we are not fighting Blackness. We are fighting white supremacy. We are fighting racism. And it's not Blackness that is terrible. It's racism. So I'm going to end right there. Should I stop sharing my screen? Let me go back. There we go. Thanks.
I love that. Thank you so much, Kelly. It was incredible. I just love that because I have to say, like, I find peace. I'm one of those people that I find a little bit of resolve and comfort in just learning. And I feel like you just gave us the master class in 45, like we just got it. Say the kids got to sign up for school. They got to fill out the paperwork packet, do all that. And we just got it. So I appreciate that. I want to jump right in. You didn't do too much. I think you fed our spirit, and I so appreciate you for doing that. I want to ask some questions, and then we have some questions in the chat. I want to remind everyone, if you have questions in the chat, we're only going to get a couple, so we want to be respectful of everybody's time today. But I love so many things that you've said. One of the things that I want to ask you, and we talked about, there's this overwhelming need, as you note, to frame historical Black movements as nonviolent, to have Rosa Parks in the picture with her arms crossed and her head down. Why do you think that is, both frankly in the historical narrative, but also in the media narrative? And how do we need to think about expanding the definitions of what those movements has been as we frame what needs to be considered in the movements moving moving forward.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's not just Rosa Parks, that's King as well. That so many other leaders have been, we have given the narrative that their strength is passivity, that their strength is like, that nonviolence is most importantly non-threatening, that it's not scary, it's not terrifying, and it doesn't really compel people to action. And that I think has been what's been so disappointing or disturbing to me. And even Rosa Parks, who talked about the fact that like she wanted to speak up, but like we don't even quote Rosa Parks. I mean, we quote King a lot, but like Rosa had a lot to say. But we have muted her and we have muted her activism. And I think it is a huge disservice. And instead of compelling people to action, it really compels them to apathy. That I don't have to do much to bring about change. And that is absolutely not true.
Yeah, I love that. Because it also makes me think if it allows us to believe that somehow you can do this work without being uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, you can do this work while tweeting, right?
I'm smiling all the time. It's like not for real. I want to ask you a question that came to us in the chat. It's about COVID-19 and whether or not you believe that even though communities of color were disproportionately impacted in the death and outcomes, that the responsivity would have been the same if it wasn't having such a devastating impact on white communities. That was one of the questions that came to us from Bruce. Bruce, thank you for that question.
Man, so it's a good question. My husband and I were kind of having a cynical conversation in which this was maybe April, maybe May, I'm not sure on the month of 2020. And they had started to come out with the numbers talking about the disproportionate rates of people of color, disproportionate rates of Black people who were dying from this. And my husband said, oh, that's it. That's the end of the pandemic. And I said, what do you mean? And he was like, nobody cares about Black death. Nobody cares about us dying. Like, if this were about the wealthy, sure. Like, if this were about white people, and I know that's a very cynical way to think about it, but in some ways, he's not wrong. Like, when we see things that we feel like don't impact us, don't alter our lives. When Jen Chudy gives those statistics about how white people buy homes, put their kids in schools, go on vacation in which they don't ever have to see a person of color, then of course it would make sense to them that this would not matter, because who do I know? Who do I go to school with? Who do I live next door to? Who am I going to visit that looks like someone who has been hurt by this or harmed by this or sick by this? I had a white person tell me, honestly, I don't know anybody that's gotten COVID. And I was like, whoa, like I know people that have died. And she was like, I mean, I know a few people that have gotten sick, but they were fine. And that shocked me. Shocked me that she was so insulated. And this was over the summer when we were still having peaks. Yeah. So yeah, I do think that has a huge impact on how we have taken the seriousness of COVID.
I love that because it feeds into a question from Adam Grant. Adam, thank you. It's how do we raise the argument from one of zero-sum game to that this work is a rising tide, that if we lift everyone, the collective lifts? How do you think we should be thinking about that? Don't you love that question? It feeds.
I love that. I stand by that. I stand by it. Motto, lift while we climb. Like that is what the National Association of Colored Women, that was their anchor. That was their motto. And I believe in that wholeheartedly. We do not live in a world of scarcity. Not really. Yeah. People are hoarding. White people are hoarding, right? Like, let's just have honest conversations, because this is the thing. If everybody has a home, that does not mean that, that's the end of it. If everybody gets educated, somehow education doesn't matter. If everyone's employed, that these things lose their specialness about them. It's just not true. There's enough health to go around. There's enough wealth to go around. There's enough housing to go around. There's enough education to go around. But because of capitalism and a lot of other things, we live by quota systems. Only so many people can be successful. Only so many people can win. Somebody's gotta lose. I wholeheartedly push back on that. I think that the only way America is going to be great is if the people who are at the bottom, who are most marginalized, have what they need, have their needs met.
I love that. You know, when the pandemic first started, my brother and I talked about this a lot. And his observation was that, you know, as humans as an animal, we're the only animal in nature that feels the need to hoard. But people were out and sort of buying too much. And he was like, it tells you sort of as a creature of how we sort of evolved, and it's dangerous. But I agree with you, because we measure so much of our success based not on just what we have, but whether or not I have more than somebody else. Another question that has come up in the chat is in regard to the powerless building power. Could it be equated to aiming to decentralize the centralized control system?
Yes.
I know. Damari is also giving us alliteration riffs, so we love how poetically.
I think that at the end of the day, if we want to see the change that we, or the world that we sort of all aspire to live in, you have to have gross reappropriation of resources, reappropriation of wealth, reparations. You have to repair the harm that was done. And I'm not just talking about like money or financially. I mean, there is real trauma and harm associated with racism that's not just like the 8 cents that Black people own or have in their bank accounts. There is a real shifting of power that has to happen. And I think, you know, the thing with white supremacy is that it teaches even poor white people not to relinquish the power and the privileges or the advantages that come with whiteness. And that, to me, you know, the thing that people don't understand is that white supremacy even hurts white supremacists. Like, that everyone is harmed. Everyone is harmed by this. No one is winning. You know what I mean? Not in a real sense, not in a soulful sense. So yes, I absolutely think that there has to be like drastic changes that are made. It doesn't have to be violence. It doesn't have to be violence. I think we look at violence as a pinpoint for that. But I often think that violence is not about violence for violence sake. I often think people often use it from a defensive perspective to arrest the violence that they themselves are experiencing.
I love it. Listen, you guys, the chat, the questions are lighting up, and I apologize, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. I encourage you, tweet Kelly on Twitter, get your questions out there. We'll try to respond to them. Hashtag justice, that's just, tag the foundation, tag Kelly. We'll get to some of these questions. Kelly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Bye.
We're going to take a quick break, guys, and we'll be back with the next panel. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at Justice That's Just.
Hi, my name is Raj Shaidev. I'm with Silicon Valley Debug, and we coordinate the National Participatory Defense Network. Participatory defense is a model of organizing for families and communities to impact the outcome of cases of loved ones that are facing charges and collectively transform the landscape of power in the courts. How we're transforming a new vision of justice in America is by tapping into an instinct that exists and has already existed here of communities that have been targeted and decimated by mass incarceration, of wanting to fight back. Unfortunately, the court system has really been insulated, I would say by design, from community pressure. With participatory defense, we're essentially penetrating those walls of those courts and bringing community power and community organizing and community intelligence to the court actors to change, dismantle that system, and create new pathways towards justice that we all create together.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I am Fina Robinson Mock, Program Officer with Communities for Just Schools Fund, and we are a proud partner of the Public Welfare Foundation. We're a national donor collaborative that supports and resources grassroots community organizations as they organize for transformative education and youth justice in their schools and communities. Today, I feel like I hit the lottery. I am honored to be able to moderate a conversation with an incredible group of leaders who are working not just on the front lines, but what I like to describe as the freedom side to transform justice in communities across the country. Each of the leaders that we'll hear from today truly exemplify through their life's work, justice that's just. And today we'll center their bold and innovative ideas that are taking shape in Washington, D.C., Louisiana, Colorado, and Milwaukee. Throughout this panel conversation, I want to invite everyone to please drop your questions in the Q&A box. We'll aim to hold space during this panel to take your questions. So please share both questions, sparks. You can also share virtual snaps if you want, affirmations, anything that comes up for you as you hear this conversation today. So now let's quickly introduce our panelists and then we'll get right into the conversation. Today, again, honored to be joined by Patrice Sultan, founder and executive director of DC Justice Lab, Ernest Johnson, director of Ubuntu Village, New Orleans, Richard Morales, deputy executive director of Latino Coalition for Community Leadership, and Mark Mertens, administrator of Milwaukee Division of Youth and Family Services. Welcome everyone to this conversation. All right, so let's just dive right in. I am actually going to turn to Patrice Sultan first. My great pleasure to introduce you, Patrice. And when we think about your work at DC Justice Lab, you've unlocked so many possibilities for justice transformation in Washington, D.C. And your work has brought a much needed shift in the narrative of how we think about policing, incarceration, and transformative possibilities in the district. So Patrice, can you reflect on what you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities of this past year in your work? And also, happy 1-year anniversary to DC Justice Lab.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with everyone. We're brand new and I'm getting so much energy from this space. And it's really, I'm just really grateful to be here, to be galvanized and to help share out what we've been doing. It's been a really busy year here. We don't find any passion in playing small and have been taking really, really big swings in all of those spaces in policing and prosecution and punishment here in the district. And I think that this year has been an opportunity in and of itself, right? That there has been a a change in the narrative nationally about what the goal is, right? What the North Star of reform or abolition looks like, and a much more widespread understanding of how far off that goal we really are. And so I'm excited to be in this work in the nation's capital. I'm excited to be in a position to have enough people around us who want to see the same change that we want to see, helping move the work forward. So it's really great to be with everyone here.
Thank you so very much. I am excited now to turn to Ernest Johnson, Director of Ubuntu Village, New Orleans. Ubuntu Village fights for social, economic, and transformational justice for children and communities, and works with families of youth who are involved in the juvenile legal system. And on a personal note, I first met Ernest Johnson when I began my journey to the work of youth justice in New Orleans. And I am so grateful for all that I have learned from Ernest. So thank you for what you do. And Ernest, as we know that at times there can be some tension among system-based reforms and community-based solutions. And I'd love to hear your reflections on how we can reconcile this. How do we advance system-based reforms and community-based solutions working to advance justice that's truly just?
Thank you for having me, Dana. I think first of all, we have to look at those individuals who are working in systemic systems in a way that we look at humanity and understand them in a way that we want to reflect on ourselves. I think we have to build relationships with the understanding that we are all have a common goal. I find that sometimes that it's complicated because people get into systems, and I think we need to identify when we are talking about systems opposed to human beings that operate those systems in a way that creates us to build relationship and understand how systemic systems work. And I think it was interesting how the last presenter was saying we need to read and educate ourselves. And I think that's more important, to educate ourselves and understand how systems operate. I don't think we can solely depend on systems. I think we need to transfer that type of energy to the community and begin to become not systems in our community, but become communities that care and share and take care of ourselves, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't want anybody or any family having to deal with the system and believing that a system that has failed us for the last 400 years to do something for us that we can do for ourselves. So I think moving forward, we have to have a lot of hope in the young people that are coming behind us. We need to educate them in a way to have them carry the baton in a way that we want to see the world we want to live in. And we have to work diligently at abolishing systems that does not do anything for us as a community.
Thank you so much, Ernest. And maybe as a quick follow-up to ask you the same question that we asked Patrice, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities of this past year?
It's always economics, right? That, versus, wealth gaps that and disparities across the board. We often identify disparities in specific categories, but the disparities that exist among us in the communities of color in particular is always a challenge. Over the last year, we got paralyzed for a little while. I think all of us got paralyzed in a way that we, didn't know how outcomes of this was going to become. But I think overall, we were able to move forward. And most of the obstacles was the lack of having the relationships with human beings and talking to individuals in a way that we normally, talk to them and service them, and isolating families in a way that we weren't able to get in touch with them. So I think the isolation and the paralyzing of a total community was one of the biggest obstacles that we faced during the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I know that probably resonates across this network. Thank you so much for that, Ernest. We'll turn now to Richard Morales, Deputy Executive Director of the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership based in Colorado. And Richard is leading groundbreaking efforts to transform safety in Colorado by redirecting resources from prisons to community-led efforts, economic development, and technical assistance support. And Richard, much of your dynamic work happens in coalition with others. So I'd love for you to reflect a bit on how can we best hold diverse coalitions together and keep them pushing the work in the same direction? And if you could also touch a bit on some of the challenges and opportunities over this past year.
You bet. So in Colorado, one of the things that we've been able to do is work with our partners over at the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition and move about $70 million out of government and deeply into community. And those are community-based organizations that are providing reentry, crime prevention, victim services, and harm reduction. And many of these folks are people who have lived experience. So developing those entities is critical, but you have to have the resources, the power, and the shared decision-making along with those systems to really make this work. And so we've seen that happening over and over again, and those communities growing into that space. But how we did that again was we're so used to fighting over that same small slice of pie. So we had to go out and get more pies. So that was off the table. And so really bringing community together and looking at this as an issue, not territorial, not everybody sharing and keeping their own secrets because they're afraid to give up something that might give somebody else a competitive edge, but really creating a movement and everybody seeing that we're going to tackle reentry, we're going to tackle violence in our communities. These are the things, as Ernest said, these are things that squarely fit within community. We don't need more police, we don't need more jails, we don't need more correction systems. We need more community really vested into this and resourced well enough to do this work. What we've seen over, the last 18 months in terms of some of these challenges and opportunities is, the challenge is that, people who are hungry were just hungrier. People who had poor jobs had no jobs. So as, the federal, state, local government was shutting services down, that left even a bigger hole. So community once again stepped into that space and then gave a lot more of themselves, figure out how to work this, get services to people that are needed. The challenge to that was they did it at a great cost to themselves. They gave and gave and gave, and when they felt like they couldn't give no more, they felt guilty about that and then just continued to give. So that self-care aspect is real.
Absolutely, Richard. Just so appreciate you lifting up that point. And I'm going to turn now to Mark. Mark Mertens has been leading groundbreaking efforts also in Milwaukee County to reduce the number of youth incarcerated there, and not just reduce, but ultimately zero out that number. Mark has also called for a redirection and reinvestment of resources previously used for incarceration into community-based programs and transformative systems of care and support for young people and their communities. And so, Mark, we know that our justice system is in need of a total overhaul. Meager gains aren't going to get the job done, but we also know that we're balancing this tension with the need to start somewhere. And so in your work, how do you balance these tensions when deciding where to place your focus and energy? And if you could also touch on some of the challenges and opportunities over this past year.
Thank you. Yes, there have been incredible challenges this last year. Many, within our own division, dealing with the grief, frankly, of loss. People in my division that have lost loved ones either to the pandemic, one of the two pandemics, I'll say, either to to COVID or to gun violence. We've lost family members to both within our division. So, trying to keep us strong as a family, a working family is a challenge in these times. And one of the things that I think that a leader is responsible for is authentically communicating optimism, even in really tough times. So it really had to communicate that we can get through this. we can make lives better, even in the face of escalating violence in our community, escalating serious youth crime in our community. That's been a challenge, and there's been some momentum to swing the pendulum back the other way. So we've been working to build coalitions. This feels a little different than previous attempts to swing the pendulum, in that I think we have more people that are working together to solve problems, to look from a public health perspective at violence in our community. So we work closely with law enforcement, with our chief judge, with the Office of Violence Prevention, with the medical college and others to be proactive wherever we can, and to create a culture where we move beyond the finger pointing and looking for someone to blame, and we start to really recognize that our community is distressed, and it's been distressed for generations because of disinvestment, because of racism. We're one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and we have one of the greatest disparities of wealth and health disparities as well in the country. So we have a lot of challenges. So the only way to face those challenges is to move away from the things that don't work, like over-incarceration, and reinvest toward things that are going to make a difference.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. I see I'm monitoring the chat box a little bit here to see some shout outs to Patrice and your work, and also want to just encourage folks to please drop your questions in the Q&A if you have some, or any sparks or reflections that come up for you. Patrice, we'll turn back to you. So as we reflect on this past year and all of the various ways that circumstances of this year ushered in moments and movements for transformative change and possibility, where in your work at DC Justice Lab are you seeing some tipping point opportunity? So that's sort of part one. And then maybe part two to that is also this question around coalitions, because I see that we had a question in the Q&A around coalitions. So just curious, how do you work in coalition or hold diverse coalitions together and keep them pushing in the same direction in your work?
Well, with respect to a tipping point, right, there are some huge changes that appear to be right on the cusp of in DC, but that last push is sometimes the hardest push. And so one example of that is my job before this was rewriting the DC criminal code, right, the whole thing. And it's a really, really big lift. It's a difficult challenge to carve out the law with the kind of clarity and precision that it deserves to have. And I know that Colorado is looking to do something similar. Maryland's looking to do something similar. And I sort of come to policing and these other spaces with the same goal in mind, right? Like, why not do an entire overhaul? Why not just start over? There's no way that we could possibly make this worse. And even though it feels like really big swings a lot of the time, when you look at how other communities live and the liberties that a lot of other people have outside of the Black people who live in DC, it's obvious that it isn't really asking too much, right? And so that's how I come into this work, right? We're not asking for too much, and we're not asking, quite frankly. This is something that has to be done. There's power that exists there. And so I don't really see this as sort of moving power into community. I think the power is already there. I think we need to use that power to move things in a really significant way. And we have a lot of proof of concept already that when you center the voices of people who are affected, that's where the best ideas live. We wrote an expungement bill that fixes the record sealing statute in DC that they couldn't fix for the last 16 years. And because we wrote it with returning citizens, we were able to do it in a matter of weeks. And it's better than anything that DC's had. It's better than anything any other state has with respect to record sealing, as far as I'm concerned. And it was introduced by more than half the council, which is all you need to pass something like that. And we're going to do the same thing with policing. We're going to do the same thing with the conditions of our jail here. And in 6 months, having 3 huge bills like that already introduced, I feel really confident that that tipping point is really near if we can stay the course.
powerful. And I'm just want to take a second to really lift up what you said. I mean, really, like, we're not asking, right? When it comes to justice, there's no compromising on that. So I just so appreciate that energy and that vibe. Thank you. Turning to you, Ernest, again, this past year has been one where many organizations have approached their work in new ways because this moment has called for that. In your work, what new innovations have you tried as a result of the circumstances of the last 18 months?
Well, it's obvious that we've become participants in Zoom and using social media, and I'm relying on a lot of my staff to also do that, but utilizing non-in-person meetings was one of the greatest tools that initially I thought I wasn't gonna like, right? It was just like something really new to me because I was used to the human contact. But after utilizing it for a period of time, it kept us connected in a way that we were able to still do some of the work that we were doing. But it became, at some point, we got fatigued, Zoom fatigue, that we realized that we had to start going out and having contact with some of the parents that we work with. So I think that was one of the most innovating things for us. It wasn't really innovating because everyone was utilizing it, but the way we utilize it to make contact so that we were able to still have the human contact and kind of bring people together in a way that we normally wouldn't have during the pandemic.
Absolutely. And yes, Zoom fatigue is real. Thank you for that, Ernest. Thank you. I'm seeing some great questions emerging in the chat box and also the Q&A, so we'll definitely make sure to turn to those. I want to turn back to Mark to ask you the same question as applied to the work taking shape in Milwaukee. What new innovations have you tried as a result of the circumstances of the last 18 months?
Well, we're trying a lot of different things, but all of them have to do, I think, with engagement. Engaging youth differently, engaging the community differently. We've introduced a Credible Messenger program, which was launched in May after quite a period of planning and training. So I'm really proud that that's off the ground. As a part of that, we had what we call the learning community, where we actually brought in trainers to train over 50 credible messengers from 11 different community agencies, and really then developed the program from that, and ended up selecting 5 different agencies after talking to all 11 about readiness to see which of the 11 were prepared to scale up and begin to implement the program on a bigger scale. We selected 5 to do that. But what I learned from that was that it wasn't really about program development. It wasn't about sort of sitting in our ivory tower and saying, we want this program, so we're going to write an RFP and select a winner, and by virtue of that, select a bunch of people that don't get funded. We decided to approach it from a more horizontal grassroots perspective. And that's the way we want to go forward with a lot of things. We're experimenting now with a participatory budgeting process where we involve the community to help identify issues and help identify the solutions for those issues, so that it isn't us saying, here's the solution, we're the experts, but we're actually trying to work with the community on identifying those solutions and then finding ways to build capacity in the community to do that. So many small agencies don't have the capacity to compete for government contracts through the RFP process. So we're really trying to level the playing field a little bit, acknowledge the amazing talent and hard work and incredible organizations that we have within our community, that are doing the work every day, whether they get our contracts or not. So how do we build and how do we grow that capacity? I think that's the primary thing that I learned. We've done a lot with programming. We're establishing a new case management model that's both built on positive youth development called the growth-focused case management model. We're getting interest from other jurisdictions around the country about the model. I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about our work to zero out corrections. We've hired a project manager whose only focus is exercising all of our strategies to get us to zero. So there's a lot of exciting things going on.
Incredibly powerful. Thank you so much, Mark. And coming to you next, Richard, we know that everyone is deeply engaged in this work and it can be hard to sometimes have time to share what's happening. So how are you getting the word out about the new and transformative models for justice that you all are building in Colorado?
You know, we've been blessed to have a lot of partners like Public Welfare Foundation that are helping us get the word out, and jurisdictions hearing about what's happening in Colorado and coming in to see firsthand. So meeting with the community partners, meeting with the agencies that we're working with, meeting with us as an intermediary to try to figure out how this works, because the truth is every jurisdiction has all of these same elements. There's no magic here in Colorado other than this focus of people coming together and willing to do the hard work and just, you know, find the solutions. So we're seeing a lot of that word getting pushed out. We've had the Urban Institute push out reports about what they're seeing and finding here. So those kind of instruments, and through just others coming in and saying, hey, what's happening there? It looks like there's something interesting. And each community is going to put their own spin, their own take on it, because Colorado isn't Louisiana, isn't Minnesota, you know, on and on. So you have to be able to get really creative with your community and figure out what works, and then keep innovating on that, because there is no finish line in this work. So you're constantly trying to find new and creative ways, because at one point we think we had it, and then we discovered, well, the same family that has someone returning for prison has a kid involved in the gang, has some domestic violence. So why aren't we braiding all of our services together to try to approach the family as a whole? But that takes a lot more coordination at a community level. So there's all these things that we're constantly trying to do to innovate and get the word out and inspire others.
Thank you so much, Richard. And yes, that work is truly, truly inspiring. I want to turn now to some of the wonderful questions that I see coming through. There is a question. I'll read it out. Can the panel name some of their most successful strategies that they've used working with government agencies, elected officials, and court systems that do not see the need for complete overhaul, but just incremental reforms? Patrice, would you like to take a crack at that question?
Sure. So one of the things that I think worked well for the Criminal Code Reform Commission, which is still underway, like the big rollout is today and tomorrow. But what was different about the way that we went about doing this as compared to other earlier efforts that didn't make it is we had a feedback loop all along, right? So every month we met with an advisory group that was the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General's Office, because those are our two prosecutors in what is not a state yet, the Public Defender Service here, and legal scholars, and submitted recommendations to them and got feedback orally and writing all along the way. And in contrast to what happened in another state that did a project like this, they'd spent 4 years writing this because it's really, really hard to do. And at the last minute, the Attorney General just filed 30 pages of objections and killed the entire project. And so I think having relationships, even if they're not what you would consider friendly relationships or relationships among like-minded people, still matter. The conversations still matter, even when they're contentious. And so that's something that I think has been really important to the success of that project. And I would describe that as both something really transformative and something incremental, right? It's not an abolition of the criminal legal system. It's a tailoring of it. It's making it clearer and more precise, but it's a dramatic change from what we have now, which is just these very broadly written laws that expect police and prosecutors to apply them fairly and act disappointed every time.
Thank you for that. Yes. What I want to open it up to our other panelists to maybe approach that same question around some successful strategies that you've used working with government agencies, elected officials, court systems, again, that do not see the need for complete overhaul, but just incremental reforms. Ernest, do you have any reflections on that question?
Yeah, we just recently had a bill passed in Louisiana, House Bill 216, that became a debt-free juvenile justice system that eliminated fines and fees. And one of the most strategic things I think was with us to make us successful is we had partners, unlikely partners that normally wouldn't be partners with us, to have a voice in this bill, right? And we kind of took the back seat and educated the community, but in a hierarchy and system players, we allowed those voices to have the voice and talk to them. I say that to say, as leaders, I think a lot of times we have to step back, right? And have a reflection and have a strategy that's going to reach a common goal without having an ego that it's my bill or I have all the power and I can make a change in a way, and utilizing everyone's voice on the same scale, right? And balancing in a way that amplifies the importance of each and everyone who's a part of this to have some value, right? And a lot of times through this process, and I tell you, it's a job dealing with the Louisiana legislature, right? It's a different beast, but we had unlikely folks, again, that we normally wouldn't work with, to amplify their voices and amplify our voices at the same time to get the bill passed. I'll leave you with our greatest goal in being strategic is building relationships. It's easily done in Louisiana over hurricanes sometimes and over good meals sometimes. But we like to build relationships, right? And have the value and look at the humanity in every human being. And when you do that, you can build a trust factor, because I don't have any trust in the system. So I have to rely on human beings to make that happen.
That's a word right there. Thank you, Ernest. Same question for you, Richard. And then Mark, I'll also come to you with the same question.
I think for me, echoing some of what Ernest was talking about is the relationship. And there was a couple things that we had to do right away. Is one, just demonstrate our competence and our character. Those were key in being able to come into this space, because where we had started was, we had a terrible incident where our director of parole was murdered by a parolee. So the system was going to put another $10 million into the system to try to fix this, and the community was nowhere to be found. So our partner agency, CCRC, went and fought for the money, and it's always a fight for the money. So that's where you have the power, the decision making, the resources to move a lot of these things. So we stepped into space under kind of an adversarial type of situation of they really didn't want to give us the money. So we had to come in and step into this and prove, through the reporting, through the data collections, through the accountability, through the demonstration that our community could serve community in a way that they couldn't. So that was incredibly important, and over time develop those relationships to demonstrate that over again and again. And in a place where the program had first started back at $500,000 a year is now $7 million a year, and the department kicks in another $2 million. So they're actually coming to the table with all this additional resources because they're seeing the value that community can play, but that relationship through the character and competence had to be built.
Powerful, Richard. Thank you. And Mark, same question for you around successful strategies.
Yeah, thank you. If there were one or two really singular strategies that we could sort of hang our hats on, we would, whoever knew them and had them would be out on the speaking circuit, sharing that information widely. It's really a matter of all the things that have been talked about here: relationships, being genuine, being unrelenting, having absolute determination, knowing your mission, knowing your purpose, and sticking to it, having laser focus on it. And always being able to speak through the lens of the people that you're serving. I was really struck by Dr. Carter Jackson's presentation earlier, and the quote about life not being a spectacle, and that a crying man is not a dancing bear. And I think about yesterday. I attended a hearing, a change of placement hearing on a young girl, 16, African-American girl in our system, where the district attorney was looking to change her placement to a correctional setting, and made her opening argument referring to the case, consistently calling it the case, and citing 20 plus placements since she was removed by Child Protective Services, and placement disruptions, and now we're here, and the only thing left is to basically lock her up. And I just wanted to jump out of my chair. Frankly, I don't attend many hearings at this point in my career, only when it's really necessary. And so I bided my time to really correct the whole narrative about this being a case. This is about this girl. And I was able to talk about attachment, and that's what's missing here. It's not about this magic place we can send her to get all better. This is a young lady that had a series of misdemeanor batteries in placement settings because she doesn't feel safe and she doesn't feel attached. So really needed to back up and help the people in the room to understand and see her as a person, and understand that just escalating, as we do so often, when plan A fails, we want to move to plan B and plan C and escalate up the chain of restrictiveness of placements, when we really should be thinking about, why isn't this plan working, from the lens of the person we're trying to help, and put things in place to make it work for them. What sorts of supports can we put in place? My worker that is working with this young lady put together a remarkable plan, found some really caring foster parents that are committed to this girl. And the case was not resolved yesterday. She remains in our detention center, and there's still a possibility that she's going to go to a correctional facility, in spite of the fact that we have an effective place for her that can help her, with people that care about her. So I'll be back in that courtroom, and I'll be back trying to talk about it through the lens of that girl. So I don't know if that's a strategy. Maybe it's just about never losing sight of that, never forgetting why you got into this work and to begin with.
Absolutely, Mark. So much of it is about changing that conversation, asking a different question, all of that. Thank you so much for that. There's a really cool question that I wanted to pose here that I see in the chat box, and it's this, and I'll sort of really just allow anyone to respond if you feel moved. And the question that came through was, do any of you see the need to build something new that does not exist? Please wax poetically on that. Would anyone like to hop in for that question? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, I would say something that would be new and very welcome would be a justice system that's free from bias and is fair and equitable. And that would actually put me out of a job eventually. I would love to be able to leave this job and not have to think about a succession plan. I wish I could leave it and the job would end along with my career at some point.
Thank you for that. Others?
Yeah, I would echo what Mark is saying, but I would say we were very, very intentional about naming our organization Ubuntu Village, because we believe that it's the reflection of the humanity that we see in others, that we see in ourselves. And I think if our common goal is to try to look at everything from the lens of empathy and to create a community in which we care and share about each other. And we do that in our work every day that exemplifies that character. I think too often we look way out and have all these visions about how we want to create a world when sometimes it's right there in our lap, but we don't utilize it. And I think we often look at statuses that devalue one from the other when we have so much in common. So I think we should all look at each other in a way that we see ourselves, and that we all have some value, and we all are leaders, or we all are kings and queens in a way that we exemplify that every day. And I think when we look at it that way, I think we'll see the world we want to live in each and every day that we live on this earth.
For me, a dream for me would be tackling our foster care system in Colorado. We see some of the worst outcomes. It's definitely feeding our criminal justice system. It's failing our kids. And so for community getting involved and being resourced, I think in that aspect of what we've seen in all of these other areas, that community has a lot to offer and it's being really underutilized. So just creating a fifth community reinvestment initiative, focusing on the foster care system to really start addressing that need, that for me would be quite something.
I love the question, Shaka. I have two answers. One is, as I mentioned in the Q&A, one thing is building a Black-led policy forum, right? Like a pro-Black rule-making body. I think that rules matter even when they're written in a way that is terrible, even when they're written in a way that no one respects them, they still have a practical impact on people's lives. And I think that we should be writing the rules, since we're the ones in DC, exclusively the ones being governed by those rules. And then just sort of more broadly, since you said wax poetically about it, I think building a culture, right? Building a culture that doesn't subjugate people based on what they did or what they got in trouble for that one time. And I think that that's a much harder lift, because we see that in every community that we talk to, that line drawing happens. That's what people want to do. They want to line draw and they want to subjugate. That happens in conversations I have with white people who are racist. It happens in conversations I have with returning citizens who want to distinguish themselves from people who have been convicted of a sex offense, or from people who have been convicted of a homicide offense. That otherizing is so ingrained in our culture. Even when we talk about what the solutions are, right? We like to criticize whoever's on the other side of the equation. We like to find these differences. And so if I could build something, I would build a culture that doesn't subjugate people based on those really, really artificial differences between us.
So powerful. Thank you, Patrice. I so love that question. I'm going to turn back to our beautiful list of questions here. And the next one that I see is, what strategies are panelists engaging in to shift government money currently being used to punish youth to a solution based on positive youth development and building healthy communities that respond to the true needs of young people? What's working? What are the barriers? And for this one, we can just take a couple of responses if for anyone that wants to tackle that one.
I can talk about Wisconsin a little bit. We have a system called Youth Aids, which is state general purpose revenue, tax revenue, that gets disseminated to counties. We have 72 counties. Milwaukee is the largest. According to a formula having to do with crime statistics, youth delinquency statistics, the use of correctional facilities and so on. So you get an allocation according to that formula. So Milwaukee County's allocation is just shy of $40 million. It's about 35 or 37 million right now. And out of that, we pay a daily rate for youth that get sent to the state correctional facilities. So any time that we reduce numbers, and in the last 5 years, we've reduced our numbers by about 80%. We were at about 120 youth in corrections back in early 2016. I think we're at 20 youth today. So, we've reduced significantly. And for every one of those youth at today's daily rate, that would have been $615 a day that we would be paying to corrections. So instead of paying that to corrections, we're using those funds for community-based programming. And as I mentioned earlier, we're starting now to look at how do we more directly work with community about having community participate in how those funds get spent. So as we get closer and closer to zero, those funds will be reinvested. Now, the flip side of that is that last week, our legislature voted to approve a new daily rate. So it will go, if it gets passed, it will go from the current $615 a day to $1,156 a day. So there are forces working in the other direction that are keeping the funding in the carceral system that we have to work against. And it makes it even more urgent for us to get to zero.
Yes,
thanks. In Colorado, we have a transforming safety program. So what happened was we divested money coming out of the Department of Corrections and then put that into community. And so that's in 2 pilot sites right now, Aurora and Colorado Springs, 2 areas that were identified as high crime communities. And then we pulled together a local advisory group made of community members to design what does safety look like in their community. And so all different kinds of programs came up. At the height of the program, there was 46 different community partners being funded through those funds to provide community safety in those 2 communities. COVID kind of cut that amount in half, so we're kind of restarting that up again. Good news is that the legislature just passed an expansion bill. So expands transforming safety into 2 rural communities. So we see this money coming from state government. It's in the general fund. It's year after year. They put a sunset date on it where it's reviewed, and I think another 4 or 5 years. So this money isn't like grants where you have it for 2 years or 3 years and then it's gone. This is something you can continue to build upon, showing the performance and everything that we're doing in community. So that's been exciting to see.
Thank you. And I'll pose one last question to our panelists as we get ready to wrap here. What advice do you have for this community of partners? It could be advice or final reflection around staying the course, staying uplifted, staying inspired in this work. If you could offer your final reflection, sort of a lightning round, we'd love to hear that. Patrice, we'll come back to you on that question first.
I think, what I've learned so far, right, that's being very early in this space, in this nonprofit space, is that, a lot of the things that seem easy and obvious to those of us who have been fighting for the change we want to see for a long time isn't obvious to everyone. Like the things that seemed most apparent to me was that when you center people who are affected, they have the best ideas, that it's not just about being fair. It's not just about looking like you're a nice person. That's actually where all of the most brilliant ideas are. And that's not something that's everyone's starting point. And so spaces like this, right, where we can see and celebrate each other's really great ideas, great strategies, and great work, I think matter. And I hope to see more of these conversations happen and more people pulled in to hear from experts like the people that I'm sitting next to. So it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to learn from you all. And I'm so grateful for everything that you're doing in your respective cities.
Thank you. And coming to you next, Ernest.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Patrice. I would say stay connected to nature in many ways, the trees, the water, the land, in a way that acts according to the spirit of our will. Keep uplifting each individual around you, value them as you value yourself. Use the lens of empathy and humanity to be your guidance. and never, never, never forget, and never, never give up.
Love that. Richard and then Mark.
Dang, Ernest, you're a deep well, man. I got to connect with you. For me, it's really staying connected with the community partners, the people who are on the ground doing the work. You know, our coffees, our lunches, our get-togethers, us hanging out, just hearing what's going on, sharing our triumphs, our frustrations. It lets me know I'm not alone, that there's a community, and I have a community to lean into and lean on when things are both good and bad. And for me, that's just what keeps it going.
Thank you. And Mark, coming to you next.
Two things, sort of to echo Patrice a little bit, just keep looking around in your community and nationally both, but especially in your community, at the people that inspire you, that are doing this work, that are out there every day trying to make the community a better place. And then the other thing is, you never know what's going to influence a youth. You never know if that one thing you say is going to resonate with someone, or if that one relationship that you help facilitate, maybe with an employer or a teacher, you never know what's going to make a difference. It's different for every youth. And so there's a whole ocean of possibilities out there. And you have to just keep at it until you find the right fit for the right youth.
Powerful. I just want to thank all of you so very much for this conversation today. This has just been incredible. Patrice, Ernest, Richard, Mark, thank you for your powerful work in your various communities and just for being an inspiration to us all. Thank you so very much for joining in today.
And Thena, I would be remiss if I wouldn't say thank you to Candace and Public Welfare and all the staff that were putting this together and giving us this opportunity. I salute you. Continue the good work that you all are doing.
Beautiful. Thank you, everyone.
It is important to have community-rooted organizations at the center of a movement for a new vision of justice. Because far too often, community members that are hardest hit by poor policy are never engaged in key decision-making processes and tables. Far too often, community members most vulnerable to homelessness, underemployment, and mass incarceration are only engaged as an afterthought, if at all. However, together, these community voices, when activated, resourced, and engaged, architect generative community solutions that have long-lasting impact.
For me, to be community rooted means to believe wholeheartedly that the solutions to the challenges facing young people today are found within their own communities. At CCFY, we believe the movement for a world where there are no kids in cages has to be grounded in the same communities that have been most impacted by mass incarceration. Because it's those community organizations that are going to be there for the long haul. It's the grassroots organizations that are cash poor but are rich in love. It's the formerly incarcerated credible messengers who are coming home to the neighborhood after their own incarceration to help break the cycle for the next generation. It's the family members of incarcerated youth who are helping other parents keep their kids out of the system.
Welcome back. Again, I'm Candace Jones. I'm so glad that you guys have been joining us today for Justice That's Just. I love the conversation we had this afternoon with Kelly. The panel inspired me. That's my favorite part of it, just listening to the work that's going on. And I hope that you guys are sparking some joy and enjoying yourself. I love looking at your messages in the chat and hearing the questions and responses from the panelists. I'm excited for this next conversation because this is so much about what this day is organized around, how we stay the course and continue the work. And this actually has been a real personal journey for me, both as an individual and as a team lead, to think about how we start to think about self-care to sustain the pace of what is really difficult work. Kelly's conversation helped us put that in historical context. We are doing a multiple generations fight. And if we know that that is true, how do we need to take care of ourselves? I'm excited this afternoon to be joined by two women who've been thinking about that a lot. Gina Clayton Johnson of SE Justice Group in California and Amanda Alexander of the Detroit Justice Center. Both incredible leaders. Hey, ma'am, how are you doing? Gina, Amanda joining us. Before I let you guys jump in, I'm going to embarrass you. I'm going to read a little bit and run through your bios. I have to do it. So please humor me. Gina is the founder and executive director of SE Justice Group, a group that does incredible work on behalf of women who have loved ones that are incarcerated. She looked across the field and saw something that wasn't there. And like any good Black woman would do, she got up and created it. She just has an incredible resume. She's a USC undergrad, Harvard Law grad, has won an incredible number of awards, including a Soros Fellowship and Echoing Green Award, all the things. I love that we're going to have a conversation with her about self-care because she is clearly an overachiever. So how do you have them both? I can't wait to get into conversation with Gina about that. But before I do, I'm excited and always thrilled to introduce our partner, Amanda Alexander, also a founder and executive director of the Detroit Justice Center, doing incredible work. When I talk about the Detroit Justice Center and try to describe what they do, I'm like, they're changing the world. You can't just say it's justice reform. You can't just say it's community building. You can't just say it's economic development. It's all those things. They're trying to design the world and the space for equity that we all want to see. Like Gina, Amanda has an incredible resume. She is a BA from Harvard, a PhD from Columbia, a JD from Yale. She also is a Fulbright Scholar, has won incredible number of awards, from including a Soros Fellowship and Echoing Green Award. Both of them have been published. We're thrilled to have them here to talk to us about, with all the things that we're doing in the world to make it a better place, how we sustain the course by taking care of ourselves. Gina and Amanda, how y'all doing?
Doing well.
Oh my goodness. Like, can we start a conversation about self-care with a check-in?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm doing well. I'm calling from Los Angeles County. I'm in Altadena, California right now. It's where I live. And it is a hot week. We're in the middle of a heat wave. And so we're just kind of trying to muscle through that, but I'm doing really well, and I'm so happy to be here to have this conversation with you, Candace, and of course to be in conversation with Amanda, always one of my just beloved comrades and friends in the work.
I love it. Amanda, how you doing?
I am doing well. Really glad to be here with you guys. It is always a treat to be able to be in space with Gina and with you, Candace. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation. It is actually cooler here than it has been, thankfully. And so I was able to have lunch outside in my garden and not be totally sweaty. It's really nice.
I love that. I want to start the conversation by talking about your organizations. They have incredible missions. The service that they're doing in this world is exactly what we need to see. Talk to me about that. Amanda, I'll start with you. Talk about the Detroit Justice Center and its mission, the core work that you're doing.
Sure. So for us, it's really important to focus not just on what we are tearing down. There's so much talk in the criminal justice space about what we are ending. What needs to, stop. We are tearing down jails, we're tearing down prisons, all of that. But we also want to focus on what we are building up and the world that we are creating. And so we do that through what we call defense, offense, and dreaming under one roof. And so the defensive piece is where we provide legal services and meet people where they're at in terms of some of the most pressing needs that Detroiters have when it comes to criminal legal system involvement. So we house a bail fund that has bailed out hundreds of people from the Wayne County Jail in partnership with the Bail Project. Our attorneys are helping people resolve fines, fees, tickets, warrants, suspended licenses, child support debt from periods of incarceration, all of these things that keep people shut out of the future of the city. And then we go on offense with our economic equity practice. So that's where we have 2 attorneys who are focused on creating new approaches to affordable housing, working alongside people who have been doing urban farming in Detroit for decades now, but wanted to secure the ownership of the land that they have. So helping them to create things like community land trust, helping organizations to start worker cooperatives. And so really thinking about what are the economic alternatives to capitalism that will help us build sustainable communities. And so that is the work of the economic equity practice. And then we dream with our Just Cities Lab. And so we have a one program manager there who is focused on building out a new Metro Detroit Restorative Justice Network. So this is really working with people who have been doing the work of conflict mediation, de-escalation, restorative justice for a while, and just needed some help building capacity to hold more and more serious cases. We've launched that network in the past year. And then we're also doing some work around Divest Invest. So we have a community reinvestment program manager who is supporting work around Divest Invest at the local and state levels.
I love it. I love it. Gina, talk to us about SE Justice Group and their incredible work.
Sure. So SE Justice Group is a California-based organization. We are a loving and powerful community of women with incarcerated loved ones. So the mothers, sisters, daughters, wives, partners, girlfriends of people behind bars. We organize women and gender nonconforming people who have loved ones behind bars using a healing to advocacy 9-week cohort model. And the way that we recruit and bring women into our sisterhood, our membership, is actually through a nominations process in which we receive letters from incarcerated people who write to us telling us about the incredible and extraordinary love leadership that women across the country, really, we primarily focus in California, but we get letters from all over describing the work, the sacrifice, the love that women are exhibiting in the age of mass incarceration in all of these unseen ways, right? So we'll get letters from people that say, the reason why I am motivated to stay in my programming, to have hope and be connected to spirit and self is because my mother writes to me, because she takes care of my children while I'm here, because she puts money on my books, and I want her to have community. And so with every one of those letters, we pick up the phone and we call those women and say, we just received a beautiful letter from your son who's incarcerated, and we know he said he's incarcerated in Sentinel State Prison, and we'd love to read to you what he said. And that first touch is a isolation breaking healing touch, and with it comes an invitation to join our sisterhood. But we are so much more than a support community and a healing community. We are actually very much on the mission to end incarceration's harm to women and communities that we come from, and to build a Black feminist liberatory future for all. And so what that means is that we take on issues such as pretrial reform and sentencing, police and sheriff accountability at local and national levels. We are a proud member of the Move for Black Lives, are central architects of the Breathe Act, founding members of the National Bailout Collective. So also have been doing Black-led bailouts across the country, but really in California through our organizers every year for the last 5 years. So we've been in it and certainly following, very inspired by Detroit Justice Center and so many of our colleagues who are right there with us. But that is a little bit about what SE Justice Group is up to.
You guys are doing incredible work. So if I'm thinking about all the things that you just listed, Gina, or thinking about the work to defend and to dream, Amanda, that you talked about, You both were founders, and part of the thing that you were also thinking about, both dreaming about and defending, was the space and sanity for the teams that you were putting together. Can you talk about that? Can you talk about how you guys were thinking about that as you were establishing the mission of each one of these respective organizations? Gina, I'm going to come to you first this time.
Sure. And, I think when I think about who we were thinking about first, I have to be honest, it was our members, right? And I think what I just described was that we really started, we're an advocacy organization, we're a campaigning, base building, power building organization rooted in organizing and, long tradition of Black centered, Black led organizing work. But for us, it all started with really breaking isolation and healing. And that started at a membership level. And so what that meant was that it actually was that orientation and that principle, that commitment of healing, of really taking the time, because I will tell you that I had so much pressure at the very beginning. And I'm curious, Amanda, if you had this too, but I was getting constant questions like, what is your policy agenda? What are your demands? What's your campaigns? And I was like, whoa, we are just bringing the folks together right now and hearing what's on their minds and hearts and like trying to heal from that, trying to build, relationship and do deep listening. And it felt like there wasn't time for that. But realizing, I think, having gone through kind of the fight to create the spaciousness for that work, for that base building, that, kind of intentional sisterhood creation work to exist, made us realize that this is something that actually requires kind of strategic integration of policies, of structures, of actual concrete things in our organization to make sure that we are not doing, I think, what the default setting is, which is like everything has to be urgent and everything has to be, like out there in front and visible and winning and, and I think that kind of set us on a path towards creating the Black feminist institution value sets that have led to kind of the types of benefits and the types of work practices that we have adopted and really integrated and innovated around at SE.
I love it. I'm going to build on that question. Did you have that pressure? Amanda, talk to me about it and talk about how you thought about building that mission at Detroit Justice Center.
Absolutely. Still feel those pressures, and I think it really takes intention to unplug from that and say that we are not going to be hooked into this kind of culture of crisis and emergency. And instead, we're going to understand that this is long haul intergenerational work. And that in order for us to fight not just for small policy wins or thinking about an 18-month legislative cycle or a 4-year election cycle, we need to think in really long terms about Black liberation and what it's going to take to expand Black joy and Black freedom and to create communities where people on the planet can thrive. And that is not the work of a 2-year strategic plan, like that is work that, many generations have been doing and will continue to do. And so I think, it takes real intention to keep training ourselves to think about how do we keep a long range view and sustain ourselves and our spirits in order to be able to keep showing up for decades, hopefully, and to be elders who can pass on wisdom to young people who are going to continue this work. And so I think very intentionally from the beginning of starting DJC, I didn't want to create or recreate the types of organizations that I've always seen, as being an organizer or in movement spaces for 20 years, I've always been in spaces that were a recipe for burnout and that burned through brilliant young people in 2 years or 3 years, and turn people off from movement work. And so it has always taken a lot of intention from the beginning to think about how do we interrupt that and to create something different. And so back, 5 or 6 years ago, when we were doing some volunteer movement lawyering work that would become the seeds of the Detroit Justice Center, many of us were working, 70 or 80 hours a week. We're doing the urgent movement work on top of our day jobs. So we would, people were public defenders. I was running a prison and family justice project representing incarcerated parents by day, and then trying to support the movement for Black Lives with protester defense in the evenings. And we were not moving in a space that was sustainable. And so it was important to me to think about how can we create this, create space for the work that is urgently needed that movements are asking us to do, how can we shift that into the 9 to 5 so that then we can have time and space to live our lives and, be and cook dinner with our friends and garden and dance and do the other things that make us feel alive. And so that is something that we have tried to do from the outset at DJC. It is certainly a work in practice, especially to try and do something that is so countercultural. And we, I think we fail each other and we also succeed, but it's all part of figuring it out as we go. Part of setting that culture is, from the very first interview that I or my colleagues do with people to bring them into the team, we ask people, what do you do to practice self-care? And part of that is communicating to people that this is something that we value. And also it's a way of learning about each other. Because when someone says they love gardening, I'm like, great. We are gonna share tips on garden centers, or if someone wants to bike, wonderful, let's bike together. It's a way of figuring out how to support each other in our self-care practices. The other question that I ask is, I say, we have an opportunity here to co-create an organizational culture from scratch. And it can be a place that feels like, we are full of joy when we come into work and we feel like we're doing work with a purpose. What are some elements to you of a really dreamy workplace? And the sad part is that many people don't have an answer to that. Yeah. What they have is a lot of horror stories about organizations that they have come from. And so there's a lot of, people talking about pretty traumatic experiences, but not really having a vision for how it could be better. And so part of it is pausing and asking ourselves, what do I need in order to feel supported? What are some things that I would love to try with colleagues in order for us to be able to support each other? And there have been a couple of practices and policies that we've had from the outset that I think have helped us, but I'll get into that. Yeah.
I love that. No, this is spot on, Amanda. The one thing I just want to say, because you're talking about how you invite people to be a part from the moment they come into the organization, I want to make sure that we're inviting. I see you guys in the chat. There's going to be an opportunity at the end of this conversation for you guys to join us. So please, in the Q&A section, drop questions that you have for myself, Amanda, Gina, so that we can talk about them, because we want you guys to feel like you're going to be a part. We actually have some questions to pose to you towards the end, so get ready to that. We expect you guys to be active and engaged with us in this conversation. I'm ready. Amanda, talk to me about the actual policies that you guys have worked on and put in place that you think really sort of protect the kind of culture that you wanted to create.
Yeah, so a couple that I'll highlight. The one is we have a communications policy that we borrowed from the Sustainable Economies Law Center out in the Bay Area, SELC. And that is one where we really try and hold each other to not calling, texting, or emailing about work outside of work hours, so not in the evenings or on weekends. And I have never worked in a place where I have not felt like I was on call 24/7. And so it's something where it really takes us collectively committing to this, because as soon as there's one or two people who are emailing about work on a Saturday morning and other people are checking it and chiming in, suddenly everyone is working all Saturday. And so it really is something that we have to commit to collectively, to say, we are going to really focus and you will have my time and attention while we're all here during work hours, but then we're also going to really protect each other's time outside of that. So that has been one, I think, that has helped us really maintain our focus, but then also maintain our time outside of work. Another is we borrowed a hibernation policy from the Sustainable Economies Law Center as well. And so that is one where the last week in December, we shut down. And I know many organizations do this, fortunately. And the beauty of that is that it's not just a single person kind of like taking a vacation and then coming back to an inbox, that's packed and all these things that they feel like they have missed or that they're behind, but instead it's everybody. Kind of taking that collective pause and then coming back to the work refreshed. And we have done 3 of those hibernation periods, or recharge weeks, we call them, since the start of the pandemic, where we have just realized that we are working in really extreme conditions. And so we need even more opportunity to recharge and come back. And so we have taken staggered over the course, because we're a larger team now. So we have 3 weeks where we take a week off in phases and really protect each other's time. Our colleagues are recharging and they will come back to us. But so we have found that has been helpful over the course of the pandemic to do more and more hibernating and recharging. And Before we went into the December hibernation, I shared with the team this anecdote or the story that Alta Star, who's a somatics coach and trainer, tells, and it's about Frederick Douglass, who was, traveling in the British Isles in the 1840s, and he was, there for a couple of years and raising money for his own freedom and for abolition work in the States and building relationships with abolitionists in Britain, and all of it got to him. And he was just, apparently feeling very burnt out. And so he bought a violin. This was something that made him feel that he came alive. And he locked himself in a room for 3 days. And a biographer said that he was there practicing his violin until he'd come out and he felt attuned with himself and could greet the world as a cheerful man. And Alta says, like there's nothing more that we could do that's more important for our movements than to take time like that to nourish our spirits and to center our own relationship with our aliveness so we can get right back to the work. And I wanted to share that with the team because if Frederick Douglass can do this while he's raising money for his own freedom and he has the end of slavery, on his shoulders, we can do this too.
Writing a memoir that would be a legacy of history and leading all kinds of movements, including suffrage. He was busy. Gina, I want to get you in here talking about how you have created policies similarly to sort of protect sanity, protect space, and hopefully spark joy. Talk about some of the things you guys have done at ESSE.
Sure. And Amanda, I just so appreciate you bringing in Alta. I was thinking about what are my self-care practices going into this conversation? And the very first thing I wrote down was Alta, because she's my somatics coach. I meet with her weekly and I don't know what I would do without the sustainability that offers. So yes, brilliance. We have a lot of different policies that we've been innovating on. And I think that there's this is actually Amanda and I have talked about really wanting to collectivize the knowledge that exists even in this space and hear other people's ideas of what could be even better, different kinds of, more policies. I think there's just a font of just different things that people are trying that we should all have access to. But some of the quick things that we've tried and I think have worked are, despite that we have already some pretty great vacation policies and personal time and sick time, we also took some very deliberate kind of organizational shutdown moments that we called resets. And we set up for those resets very intentionally by providing a retreat in advance. This was all virtual because it was during COVID, or the height of social distancing and all of that. And so we had communicated and worked on really preparing ourselves for our resets in a way that it would ensure that they were not just kind of other times when we would either work or catch up on work or clean out and reorganize our garages or just do things that would leave us just as depleted as we were going into them. There's a way in which we needed to kind of center ourselves into a collective commitment to show up for ourselves during that reset. And I think that was the brilliance of what happened, because we did find that we noticed that, maybe we would have done it wrong, took our time off in a way that wasn't really off. And so that was one thing. The other thing is, we have a reentry policy at ESSE, so that when someone has a loved one who comes home from prison or jail, that they have time that they can spend, paid leave with their family during that process. We provide access to grief counselors and not just kind of the traditional talk therapy, which we also provide access to, but to Reiki practitioners and somatic therapists and coaching, that kind of thing. We also do a $300 a month health and wellness reimbursement for anything that you want to invest in to help you kind of take care of self and be restored for the work. I think that and those are just a few of the things, but I think the most important thing to understand is that all of this is rooted in a reality that this is both a strategy and a politic for us. It's a strategy because we get, and I think this is really beautifully said by Amanda, that our work can't happen if we are not well. It certainly can't happen in a way that's successful and in a way that's sustainable, and in a way that's winning, right? If we are not well. And so we must be well. Number two is that it is a politic that we have to resist, right? The kind of the oppressive realities and conditions that have been foisted upon us that have taught us to deprioritize self, to ignore what our bodies are telling us, to not connect with each other in real and authentic ways, and so many more things, right? So like, it's also a politic. And then finally, I think organizationally, and as like an ED, I think like I have a lot of, I don't know, just like humility about the huge weight of the task in front of us and trying to create these cultures and these workspaces that are really kind of these maroon spaces that are supposed to exist separate and apart from the air that we breathe every day, right? Like SE is a learning institution. It's supposed to be a place where people can learn things and in the pursuit of their own growth and, excellence and goals and trajectories. And I'm a big believer that you cannot learn. And I know this because I have a 1.5-year-old right now, when I see her learning at the rate of like, just, it's incredible. And I think the reason why you learn as quickly as you learn, little girl, is because you get that no one is out here judging you. No one's expecting, you can fall over and stumble and do silly things and scream and run around like, and you don't have an expectation that like that has to look a certain way or be perfect in any way. You just try. And so I want SE to be that place. And yet we prioritize hiring Black and brown people who are directly impacted by these systems and who have been told over and over and over again that we cannot mess up. That literally there is no time for us to get something wrong, to take a risk, to stumble without tremendous dire consequence. And so those are the realities that we face when we're trying to create these cultures, is that there's actually inherently in all of us a system of punitivity that operates continuously, that we have to, as individuals, be vigilant about contradicting, about working out of ourselves, about seeing, in order for us to be able to show up the way that we want to. So it is both an organizational responsibility and commitment, but it is, I think, first and foremost, an individual path, a healing, kind of path that we must all be on. And that's what we try to facilitate and encourage people to be on their own healing journeys, toward that end.
I love that. How do you guys think about, to both of you, protecting that in real time, right? Because then the thing that ultimately happens is there's also so much both exigent, but also exciting work, right? You're like, we want to do this and we want to do this and we want to do this, but you have to be like, well, we can't protect that space, that important space, and do it all at once. So how do you guys in practice really try to keep yourselves and the team focused on that? Let's get you in here, Amanda.
And I'll unmute myself. So one thing that we have done that I want to make a big plug for is we have shifted since last summer to a 4-day work week. So we're officially open Monday through Thursday, working 32 hours a week. And yet we have been no less productive, I would say, than when we were working a full week. And what was important to us as we were making this shift was to make sure that we were not just saying, okay, we're doing a 4-day work week, but still people trying to cram in 40 or 50 hours worth of work into 32 hours. And so what this took was prioritizing. And so we actually pulled together like a half-day staff retreat, and we asked ourselves Grace Lee Boggs's question of what time is it on the clock of the world? What is really urgent right now in terms of what our movements need? What are we being called to do? How do we need to show up right now? And this was last July and last August. And so there were suddenly all sorts of things coming onto our plate. We were needing to argue individual release motions for people to get out of the Wayne County Jail with COVID, threatening to raise inside. We had to, fight for an eviction moratorium, first in Detroit and then across the state. So these were new things that were on our plate. And so we paused as a team and said, okay, for everything that we are now putting on our plate, because this is what this moment is asking for, what are we going to take off of our plate that no longer seems urgent? And I think as organizers, as movement builders, we are great at constantly adding more to our plates. But we are less good at saying, okay, we can sunset that program, or we can put that piece of the work to bed for now. And so just making sure that we are really recalibrating as we go in terms of understanding what is the most important thing that we need to be focusing on, and then what does that mean that we can kind of let go of for the moment.
I love that. Gina, I'm going to come to you, but I want to come to everybody in the conversation with us. One thing that I want to put to the entire group, this is a great question that came up in the planning from Amanda, which is, we don't purport in any respective way to have the full breadth and depth of all the possibilities in this conversation. So we're asking you guys to, in the chat, think about ideas that you would like to see in your workplaces in the world to sort of actualize self-care in these institutions doing important justice work. Please join us in that. We want to hear these ideas. Frankly, it helps us all think more and broader about these questions. Gina, I'm going to come to you with a different question, which is for organizations that they haven't done it yet, or they don't yet have the resources and breadth to start to actualize this. How do you think they need to get started?
I would say talk to your team. And I think, Amanda, actually, you're probably one of my favorite question askers. I don't know if that makes sense, but ask such good questions. And I think model really well the way in which we should be engaging with our teams, right? As co-strategists and co-builders. And so that was something that we did at ESSE. We knew we wanted to create this culture. Actually, we knew that we wanted to concretize and memorialize this culture in a set of policies, because we built the thing before we wrote it all down, which generally happens. And so there came a time when we needed like very strong employee handbook. And so the process through which we did that was through conversations about, what are our values? We spent time identifying like, what are our values, and talked about our values as a mix of both aspirational and actual. And we actually did this activity where we had, with every value that we came up with, we had people stand in a room and say, okay, how close to actual are we versus how close to aspirational, and to kind of test, right? Because we don't want to say that something's a value and we're not even close to ever, like, we don't practice it. We don't, and we also don't want something to be a value that is so easy as just us, and we're never kind of reaching for it, right? And so that was a really beautiful way to kind of start that process. And from there, we moved into like, okay, so what are the policies? What do the policies need to look like in order for us to be living our values? And so that's I think how, that's how we started. And it led to some very vulnerable and challenging conversations when we got into the meat of it, because policies are about trade-offs. And one thing I do want to say is that I'm in no way, and I'm a big fan of not being dogmatic about these things, right? If you have an organization and you are at an organization and you don't have a particular policy that we're talking about, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are, that your culture is, bankrupt, okay? It is about the whole, and it is about what is right for that individual group of people. And we knew that for us, our people were Black and brown women with incarcerated loved ones or formerly incarcerated loved ones who had a specific set of like priority needs and realities at the home and all kinds of, and that's what we built our policies around. And so I think like, that's where I would suggest starting, is just with your team. Who are they? What do they want to build, and engage them in the build with you?
I love that. Can I ask you guys, you kind of touched on it earlier, but I actually want to put a finer point on it because I think it leads to the conversation we've been having this whole day. When we talk about self-care, some people frame it as a thing that is a privilege. There are some of us, and I will include myself in this at points in my life, I've definitely felt guilt when I was away from certain work. And I feel like that's not a fluke or even just sort of youthful. That's a societal thing. That's a bigger thing that has been constructed. Talk about how you work on dispelling that. Talk about how you think it's important to dispel that for the very work we're all trying to advance. I'll start with you, Gina.
Okay, I'm so full of thoughts on this. So this goes back to like, you got to have a politic and you got to have some values, right? Because if it's just policies, they're empty and they're not going to be rooted in anything, and they're not going to be adaptable. You're not going to be able to change them and flex them in ways that are appropriate when it's required. And our politic is Black feminism. And one, central tenet of Black feminism is around the notion of collectivity, right? That like we are, we think about Ella Baker, right? Who says we don't need, strong leaders, we need strong people. And so this idea of individualism that is really undergirds so many of the political fights that we're in, right? Like our opposition loves them some individualism, right? It's like we're trying to get people to think systemically about defunding, and they're like, oh yeah, no, we're fine. Just keep talking about prosecuting a cop, right? Like that is a manifestation of kind of individualist thinking, right? But individualism lives with us, right? It doesn't just live in the external political realms in which we are engaging and fighting. It is something that we're all raised with. It's the thing that tells you that, you should feel ashamed when you need to reach out to someone for help. Like that little shame, that like worried before you text someone, you're like, oh, but I don't want to bother them, that we've all felt. That's that individualism that is like contaminating our minds and our abilities to do what our bodies naturally need for us to do, which is to be in connection with each other. I think that what we at SE try to do is to talk about that value, talk about that politic, make sure that we're all aware that it exists inside of us so that we can all be self-aware practitioners of, our own kind of healing and improvement, throughout this work. But it also means like the structural practices, right, that we've all been talking about, and really exposing and rejecting the martyrdom and the individualism that comes with like, if I'm not here, then everything's going to fall apart, right? And the way to do that, like I actually my meeting before this was a vacation checkout. And this has been one of the most important things that we do at SE, which is that if you're going on vacation for more than 4 days, you have to fill out a form that answers all of these like kind of questions about like making sure that you're going to be really unplugged, and like what's the work you've been holding and who are you managing, and all kinds of questions that then you have with another person who is there to hold all of that stuff for you, right? And so like the transfer, really, we let it happen and we ensure that it happens so that now the person the person on my team I just met with, I know she's really going to be off, because in that meeting, I was like, I got that. You don't have to worry about this, right? Like, oh, okay, I'll do that management meeting for you. This person might reach out to you and call you on the weekend. No, I got that, right? And so like, those are the kind of concrete things that we do to make sure that the individualist tendencies don't show up and kind of live in our work and culture.
I love that. Amanda, do you have, Gina killed it. Like it was a mic drop.
Yes.
Do you want to add anything?
So beautifully put. And I gotta say, we are constantly learning from SE Justice Group, and they have just led the way when it comes to thinking about Black feminist institution building. If folks have not checked out like some of the webinars that they have and the handbook that they put together over the past few years, please do. It is such a model. But I think, what I'm hearing, Gina, the way that I think about it is kind of creating more opportunities for interdependence. And ultimately, this idea of collectivity, that is what our movements are about, is deepening interdependence. And so in order for that to happen, we have to be able to express authentic needs and have them be met. And so I think that it takes a lot of practice. I think particularly for Black women who oftentimes in organizations, there's no point in expressing a need because you have no expectation that it'll be met. And it can be little things like, just making do when you don't have the right office supplies because you just make it work, And so it really takes practice to be able to be attuned to what you need, asking, people to meet that need. And then if you think about times when people have asked you to show up and you've shown up, it feels really good. Adrienne Maree Brown writes about interdependence beautifully in Emergent Strategy. And she talks about it's us weaving each other into this collective. And so when you ask someone to meet a need, you're inviting them into an opportunity for interdependence. And so often, though, we deprive each other of that opportunity, by not asking for what we need. And so Detroit has taught me a lot about what kind of, not just self-care, but what collective care can look like in interdependence. There's just some excellent practices here, and it's led by organizations like Healing by Choice, Women of Color Healing Networks, where I would say, so often there's this practice here where if an organizer, has to take a 3-month leave to have a surgery, There's a practice now in community to say, here's what I'm going to need. And someone puts together a spreadsheet of, okay, let's cover this person's meals for the next 3 months. Let's chart out who's going to show up and do some kind of healing practices with them. Who's just going to sit with them and provide emotional support? And here's what it means to provide emotional support. So thinking about that, kind of stepping away to take care of yourself and have a surgery that you need as an opportunity to actually deepen interdependence and have you feel more folded into community. And that is something where I think there's such a deep practice of that here in Detroit around mutual aid and collective care that I hope that can be infused more deeply throughout our movements.
I love that. So we're going to turn now to the questions because the time's going really fast, you guys, you know that it always does. But I want to pose one last question to you both. And the question is, which will be framed by me, these are my words. Philanthropy hasn't always supported this, right? I would say it hasn't supported it at all, and in many respects can be antithetical to it by driving a culture of quick wins and things that we want to see to be able to deliver to the organizations. How do you guys think that philanthropy needs to be thinking about supporting organizations to do just this?
Lots of ideas. And it comes down to, I think one is, encouraging a 4-day work week among grantees. I would say giving enough money for general operating support so that teams have the people that they need to get the work done. I know, especially as a founder, we are used to wearing so many hats and, making, setting the vision for the organization, making sure that payroll is met, approving every little thing. We're used to wearing 5 or 6 different roles at once. And the beautiful thing about building this organization has been, adding things like a director of operations and HR. Because if we're going to survey staff about their needs, that is something that an HR director can send around, and then based on the responses, can figure out what resources are out there. That is something that requires labor. And so that is something that people should be paid to do. My life shifted radically last year when I was able to hire a deputy director. Who took on a lot of my direct reports and a lot of the, kind of day-to-day in the weeds managing of the organization. And that is something that, having more funding made possible. And so I would say robust funding so that people can, just fit the amount of work that they need to be doing into the amount of time that they have. And that people in teams are well supported and well resourced. I think supporting things like wellness budgets and recognizing that these things take resources and that our most important resources are our people and each other. And so it's on philanthropy to make sure that we are able to take care of each other and take care of our teams.
I love it. Gina, I definitely want to get you in on this one.
Yeah, big check to all the things that Amanda said. I won't repeat them, but I'll just add funding sabbaticals, I think could be a good helpful thing in addition to the healing grants and support for staff wellness. I think thinking a little bit about grant reporting requirements and just what those look like and whether or not there are ways to make them a little bit more easeful for the grantees makes a lot of sense. And then one thing that this is maybe a little random, I'm curious what Amanda thinks about this, but I always think about how important place is, right? In terms of building inspiration, cohesiveness and team. And so we do invest in our office space being really nice for team, things like that. But we also need to go to nice retreat centers and have time to strategize with good, healthy food and a nice environment. And oftentimes those are very expensive and hard to justify in budgets when you have 2 or 3 options and one is the bare bones. And I think some permission from funders to say go to the nice place, take your team there, would go a long way to let us really kind of do that part of the work. It feels like these are things that we are raised to understand as luxuries and excess, but are actually integral. And there's a reason why these other sectors are doing this when they it's not excess, it's investment. And we ought to be making some of the same. So those are just some of the ways that funders could, I think, help us in the right direction.
I love it. I'm going to turn to the questions now, if that's okay with you both. Peter has a question. He asks, how can we lay the groundwork so that the intergenerational long haul maintains relevance and urgency as it is passed from generation to generation?
I love that question. I mean, I think it kind of comes back to this question of remaining attuned to, you know, like what, again, this question of what time is it on the clock of the world? And, you know, what are the things that we need to be doing in order to be nimble and responsive right now to this moment? You know, it's shifting so much. I remember being at a conference a year ago, January, where a bunch of us were down in Miami talking about building a movement for police abolition. And we thought that we were planting the seed for future generations. And then last summer, you know, defund police became a call that was reverberating across the country. And so that required us to shift because of what movement was making possible. And so I think that part of it is about constant reflection on what is possible in this moment. And that will, I think, keep us attuned to, you know, what are the possibilities in this generation? And also, again, this comes back to funders. Like if that means, you know, a shift in some of the work in order to do work that feels nimble and responsive and feels important to this moment, having the flexibility to be able to do that.
I love it. Another question. This is from Hassan Latif, a partner of ours in Colorado. We see you, Hassan. Our folks are prone to crisis moments during their transitions. We feel at the Second Chance Center that require us to be accessible to them pretty much 24/7. How can we, and he quotes, be there, end quote, for them while also being there for ourselves? What do you
Yeah, I mean, I think I go back to this idea of a team, that, you know, one person can't hold one person. Like a team needs to hold the person in crisis or the person in transition or whatever it is that the intent there is. I think that that's at least how we've been able to do it at SE, because it's so the work is so heavy. We had you know, an incident earlier this year where one of our members took her life, and it was that she had found out that on that same day, she'd learned that her husband was COVID positive. He was incarcerated. You know, she had been dealing with a lot of isolation and so forth. And the ways in which, you know, our team, of course, held that was super heavy. But the fact that it wasn't just one person who had a relationship with her, but that there was a team that had known her and that was working with her in many different crisis moments, made it possible also for the healing that needed to happen in the wake of that to be collective. And so I think about, you know, just again, like how important it is for us to be moving through challenge and through this work, connected to one another, connected to our colleagues, and really able to, like, you know, one person steps forward, the other person can step back, and you kind of continue to do that dance so that you can rest and you can restore.
This is going to be the final question, you guys. I have to ask this. Tell me one thing that you guys are going to do to care for yourself in the next 24 hours, a concrete thing. Amanda, I know you had lunch outside, but what's next? I will lead. This is for me a barefoot time of day. We're having this conversation. I don't have my shoes on. I'm dancing back and forth. That makes me happy. My family is from the South. When I take my shoes off, I am home no matter where I am. And after this, I'm going to put on a Curtis Mayfield record. I will probably play it one more, probably 2-3 times, and then go outside because I need some sunlight today and some fresh air. So that is what I am going to do to take a little bit back for myself. What about you, Amanda?
So I did it before this conversation, and I'll do it later in the day. I try and have a centering practice. And there's a beautiful one I'd recommend online, led by Prentice Hemphill, who is a wonderful somatics practitioner and trainer. And this is just taken, you know, I think that one is about 8 minutes long, where you're centering in 4 dimensions, centering. And that to me is a way to dip right back into, okay, this is long haul work. As soon as you're visualizing, you know, future generations, I love this prompt of picturing a young person in your life. Now picture their grandchildren, and it becomes very difficult then to, be too stressed out by everything in your inbox when you're thinking in that long range view in so many different dimensions. So centering and having a regular centering practice is something I will do today and each day. I also have a garden, a flower garden and a food garden that, requires water, requires some things of me, that to keep things alive. And so that is one that keeps me kind of centered and grounded as well.
I love it. Gina, last word. How are you going to take care of yourself?
Well, I'll tell you, and I also want to say that us bringing in Alta and Prentice and all of the phenomenal leaders on healing justice, without mentioning Black Organizers for Leadership and Dignity is something that we had to avoid. So huge shout out for BOLD and their phenomenal team who really gives so many of us the strength of the sustainability that we're talking about in this conversation. Alta, Prentice, and so many others. Look, I'm pregnant. Okay, so I'm gonna lay my butt down. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm so tired all the time. But that's really normally it's I'm gonna compost and I'd be out there for myself a little bit. It's hot and I'm tired. So I'm gonna lay on the couch for a little while. That's what I'm gonna do. So that's my centering practice, and also, or not my centering practice. I do have one of those too, but that's my wellness practice right now. And I do have a standing date on Wednesday evenings with a good girlfriend. We talk and catch up on the phone, and that's really restorative for me.
I love that. I'm also probably gonna watch the Versus tonight. Because I can't help myself, and no judgment. I will be excited to see both of them. Listen, thank you guys so much for joining us. We are in awe of your work. We appreciate everything you're doing to advance this work in the world. And I just want to thank you for your leadership.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you so much to you both.
And thank you all for joining us today for Justice That's Just. We have been in awe of all of the conversations we've been able to have with partners all over the country doing incredible work on justice reform. We thank you for everything that you do every day. As I said at the outset, we're not asking you to push harder, to go further, to be stronger. We're asking you this afternoon just to take care of yourself and to rest. We know you're going to do all that other stuff. As has been noted in these conversations, sometimes in this work, you're holding up so much sky and it can start to feel like it's getting heavy. I want to remind you that there is somebody working on this issue to your left and to your right. So if sometimes you have to step away for a little while, it's okay. We will be here with you on the other side. I would be remiss if I didn't thank my team. Putting together a wellness event and doing the work of wellness for others actually takes a lot of work. And so they were behind all the work and the creative ideas that came out today. And I want to thank them for that and acknowledge them. We also want to thank our partners at Meeting Tomorrow and Happy Box, which helped us with the wellness packages that went out to our grantees and partners. Thank you so much for everything you do every day. We see you and we are standing with you. Take care.